Yes. Yes, there is Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramaniam. Welcome, sir.
Very good afternoon.
Very good afternoon. So now, with you joining, we have everyone on board. So with your permission, may I start?
Please.
Good. So good afternoon and good morning to friends in Geneva, and good evening to some parts of Asia and the Pacific region. It's a pleasure to welcome you all. Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramaniam, the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Our guest joining from Geneva, UNCTAD, who is also a partner of this, Richard Baldwin, and a lead author of World Investment Report. My old friend, Professor Manoj Pant, who is director of Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, a major research and training institution of Government of India on foreign trade matters, and Mr. Deepak Bagla, the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Invest India, which is, as you know, India's investment promotion agency, and all the very distinguished friends from across the region who are joining. It's a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of ISID, and also, if I may say, on behalf of both the organizers, to this policy roundtable on leveraging FDI inflows for sustainable recovery. And it is taking place in the context of the World Investment Report 2021, which was launched last week. And we have seen some of the findings being reported of that report in the media, global media around the world. And of course, like every indicator of economic activity around the world, the news is not so good about foreign direct investment flows also. And Richard, I'm sure, will go into it. I don't want to preempt him. But I think like every other indicator of economic activity, FDI flows in the first full year after the pandemic struck 2020 went down by 35%. And as a comparator, if one looks at it, what happened in global financial crisis some more than a decade ago, the numbers of 2020 are actually lower than the FDI flows in 2009, immediately after the collapse of the Lehman Brothers. So it is very clear that this shock of pandemic is a much bigger shock than global financial crisis ever was for the world economy. And that, is a very serious bad news for the world economy, especially poorer countries. To quote from the World Investment Report, I was reading the preface by Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, and he says that FDI is a very critical resource for sustainable development of, especially in poorer countries. And so this declining is not a good news. And what is worse and more worrisome is that it has declined even more or much more rapidly in these sectors that affect sustainable development goals, like infrastructure, like food and agriculture, like health, like water and sanitation. So all different sectors which impinge on sustainable development goals, they have seen a bigger reduction, bigger decline in 2020 in FDI flows. And that is a very serious issue, very serious challenge for the policymakers around the world. India, as it would come out from this report, looks like a bright spot, because India is only among a few countries in the world where FDI flows still grew or rose last year, where everywhere else they have been declining. But even there, the World Investment Report shows that this was largely due to the acquisitions activity of Indian companies and not so much because of greenfield investments. We will get to hear more detailed, exposition of the highlights of World Investment Report from Richard. So I think this event or this discussion this afternoon is about how we leverage FDI flows in the coming years to build back better, to build more resilient, more sustainable, more inclusive economies through FDI, because this is a very important resource that is at our disposal in developing countries. So what can be done to bring them back and bring them to the sectors that we need them most? So this is how we thought we do a symposium or a policy roundtable jointly with the World Investment Report, report authors, UNCTAD. And the plan for this afternoon is that I would like to first invite Richard Baldwin, the lead author of this report, to share the insights from the report, especially from an Indian perspective or a developing country perspective. Then I would invite Dr. Subramaniam, who is a very senior policy advisor, chief economic advisor, as his title is, to the government of India, to give a thinking, to share with us a thinking from the government, how government is trying to harness the potential of FDI flows for India's sustainable development and inclusive development goals. And then we would listen to our two very distinguished panelists, Professor Manoj Pant of Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, and Mr. Deepak Bagla, who is actually managing our investment promotion agency. And then I will open it up to all of the participants for an open discussion. And I see a number of very senior experts and economists and policy analysts are in the audience. So I look forward to a very rich discussion between us. So with that, Richard, I hand over to you and for your presentation. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to yourself and ISID for organizing this event and for the invitation. As you said, I will be presenting very briefly some of the highlights of our World Investment Report. I will share my screen with you, if that's allowed, and take you through a few slides. I will take about 15 minutes or so to go through this and take you through 3 of the chapters of our report. As you may know, every year our World Investment Report has all of the data. We're a primary source for FDI data. So that's the first part. We also monitor together with OECD for the G20 investment policy developments around the world. So I'll just say a few words about that. And every year we have a theme chapter in the report, which this year looks at investment in sustainable recovery. So I'll highlight a few findings from that particular discussion. Let me go through the trends very, very briefly at the global level. So we have a 35% decline last year in global FDI flows. If we look at what we forecast early in our World Investment Report 2020, last year we were pretty much on the ball there. We predicted between 30 and 40% decline. Now, the reason that is interesting is that if we look at forecasts last year for global trade and global GDP, they were as bad as those for FDI. But in the end, while, for example, forecasts for exports by April last year were for minus 30% by the WTO, at the end of the year, it was limited to about minus 7%. And the same for GDP. forecasts early in the year were very bad, but there have been lots and lots of upward revisions of GDP growth by the IMF over the course of the year. However, for FDI, that's not the case. We saw in the beginning of the year that we went down by 30 to 40%, and we turned out to land exactly there. Now, what underpins this sort of relatively negative performance of investment compared to other macroeconomic variables? And this slide just has a few elements of the answer to that question, right? It's very different, as Nagesh already said, from the global financial crisis. Normally we have, after a financial crisis, investment reacts fairly slowly to a downturn. In most investments have a long gestation period, so it reacts with a delay, and also the recovery happens with a delay. This time around, the reaction was immediate. Closures of physical construction sites for projects basically immediately affected investment flows. The reinvested earnings of multinational enterprises, which are about half normally of FDI around the world, were also, of course, affected by a more than 1/3 decline in corporate profits worldwide last year. So the effect was immediate. What happened was that over the course of the year, the parts of FDI that are more financial flow related, such as cross-border mergers and acquisitions, and the debt component of international project finance, they started to recover fairly quickly in line with global financial markets, which were boosted by a huge liquidity influx and policy measures. But greenfield projects in industry, they continued to be very weak throughout the year, and even continued their decline into the first quarter of this year. If I look at the trends by region, sorry for this. So I mentioned already the global decline. The decline in developed economies was actually much sharper than that in developing economies. And it is a little bit distorted, this picture, by Europe, where you have some large conduit economies that distorted the picture. But if we look at the large developed economies, the decline was on average around 40%. The United States, Germany, France, on average the decline was around 40%. Whereas in developing economies, the decline was a little bit less. But some of that was really the result only of fairly resilient flows in Asia. There I have to again make a comment. The same thing happened as in Europe with conduit economies. If we exclude, for example, Hong Kong from the picture, developing Asia, which on this slide here is positive 4%, also is negative 4%, but still negative 4% is still very, very positive compared to developed countries and to other developing regions. So Asia was relatively resilient. I will not touch much on this because our introductory speaker already mentioned this point. Of course, for us as the United Nations, the investment in SDG picture is very important. Just one note on this: the only sector that is holding up, well, only -8% in value terms last year, but actually in terms of the number of projects, renewable energy investment actually increased. So that's the only part of SDG investment that is holding up very well. In fact, if we compare it with investment in fossil fuel, it is now really outpacing that sector. Just a quick look at projections forward. We think that over the course of this year, global investment flows will bottom out and we'll start seeing an initial recovery. But we will only see a return to pre-pandemic levels at best at the end of 2022. And that is at the top end of projections. The reason for that is that we think that the investment in real economic activity, greenfield investment, and international project finance in infrastructure takes time to recover from a crisis. That's the experience from past crises, and we think the same will happen now. Of course, Financial markets are very, very strong at the moment. So the transactions component and financial flow component of FDI will increase. But in our projections, we tend to we smooth that out, and we tend to look at what we expect will happen with real investment. So this is our prediction for that. A few numbers specifically on Asia here, or on India here. So we already heard India had an increase, one of the few countries together with China that saw an increase in FDI. But we saw already that most of that was the result of mergers and acquisitions, takeovers of companies in the ICT sector, and pharmaceutical and financial services are listed on top there. So that drove the increase in the headline number. The same is not correct when we look at greenfield projects. There was a decline of 19% in greenfield projects, and of course those are more relevant for actual growth in productive capacity. The same is true if we look at international project finance. These are announcement data, of course, looking ahead at what will happen. International project finance is really important for investment in infrastructure and utilities. And also there we saw a decline in the projection for the coming years. Very briefly, looking at policy developments, I mentioned already, we monitor national investment policy measures around the world. We have a picture here that is just a summary picture of our analysis here. Sorry about this. And it shows that the ratio of restrictive and regulatory measures over those that liberalize or promote foreign direct investment worldwide was at its highest level since we started measurement. Of course, part of that is or much of that is driven by increased screening measures that were introduced last year. The bulk of those measures were actually introduced by developed countries, but some of them also by developing countries, including, I believe, in India, there was an additional screening measure being introduced to avoid opportunistic takeovers of domestic enterprises, and this was a development that happened around the world. Let's look at the final part of this presentation. We try to analyze specifically what will happen, or what will happen, and what our policy recommendations are with respect to attracting foreign direct investment to promote sustainable recovery in the coming years. The way we did that was by looking at what are the type of sectors that are a firm priority, and the firm priorities are now very much driven by the wish to build more resilient global supply chains. And we also looked at what would be government priorities. And this particular slide here looks at government priorities. And those government priorities are often driven by what are the types of investments that are most useful for the buildup of productive capacities, especially in developing countries, of course. And in UNCTAD, we analyze productive capacities by looking at, or investment in productive capacities by looking at 7 different sectors that you see on the screen here: ICT, energy, private sector development type sectors, transport infrastructure, sectors or industrial investment that contributes to structural change, and human and natural capital. And the way we looked at this was we analyzed which of these sectors saw the biggest decline in investment as the result of the pandemic, and in which of them can foreign investment play a bigger role. So that's the way we try to look at what are the priorities now for the promotion of investment. Some interesting things here. Of course, we saw that investment in SDGs declined a lot last year, but still, if we look at 2 types of investment, so on the one hand, greenfield investment in industry sectors, and on the other hand, in international project finance in infrastructure sectors, we actually see that some of the industry sectors have been hit harder than some of the infrastructure sectors, right? And of course, infrastructure sectors are also those where domestic investment and public investment play a relatively bigger role compared to foreign direct investment. So in terms of industry, of investment promotion, industry sectors justify a similar level of support, complementary to many of the packages that are being adopted now around the world to promote infrastructure investment. Looking at these packages, we did a specific analysis in this theme chapter looking at rescue and recovery investment packages that are being adopted around the world. Of course, the vast bulk of those packages are being adopted by and for developed economies. You see here sort of a 1-to-10 ratio of recovery funds available for developed versus developing economies. Still, the amount of funds available for developing economies is quite large. I believe that India adopted a package worth around 220 billion. Of course, some of that is acceleration of pre-existing type industrial policy packages, still very relevant for infrastructure investment. We believe that these type of recovery packages will influence international investment flows over the coming years, especially through international project finance in infrastructure. And looking at that international project finance and infrastructure, what we do in our reports, we highlight a number of challenges. The main challenge, or one of the main challenges, will be the implementation and absorptive capacity for infrastructure investment. And this slide just illustrates that if we look at the global infrastructure investment over the past 10 years, we see that the fastest rate of growth that we had over the past decade in global infrastructure investment was about 7% per annum. And the implied boost in infrastructure investment, just by looking at the numbers in recovery packages being adopted around the world, would imply 3 times as fast growth for several years running. So the absorptive and implementation capacity constraints are going to be quite massive. I will not take you through this slide in great detail. We highlight here a sort of a policy framework aimed at guiding investment in sustainable recovery, which looks at the strategic and industrial policy element. I think that's very relevant in India. I think that the recovery package in India was very much a continuation of industrial policy, which means that it's not just about promoting investment in infrastructure, but also about promoting investment in industry, which is exactly what our findings on government priorities would highlight. But this policy framework also looks at 5 specific challenges that we see in terms of actually absorbing and implementing the boost in international project finance that we see coming over the next few years. And those challenges are about making sure that the additional international project finance is really additional, right? It adds to the existing plans, that it is oriented as much as possible towards high impact projects, that it counters somehow upward cost pressures on projects in developing countries, and that will happen because of the inclination for international investors to go for lower risk projects in developed countries, given that the recovery packages are much larger there. It's about the absorptive and implementation capacity that I already mentioned, and it is about the governance aspects of this to maintain high ESG standards. With that, that's the package that we conclude our report with, and with that I'll conclude my intervention, and of course I will be very happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for very insightful and comprehensive presentation of the highlights of World Investment Report 2021. I think one of the things which you highlighted was that the package that Indian government has adopted over the past year or so of $220 billion, focusing on industry and infrastructure, in your view, is on right track. I think this is something very good to hear for us in India, and I'm sure Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramaniam would, share with us his thinking and insights from the government of India about how we are trying to revive the economy in a more sustainable, more inclusive, more resilient manner. So it's time now for me to invite Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramaniam for his keynote speech. So over to you, Dr. Subramaniam.
Thank you very much, and a very good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on wherever you are. Let me first thank the organizers for inviting me to share my thoughts. There's a lot that I can talk on the on the reforms push of the government itself, and how I expect that reforms push to really accelerate growth going forward. But before that, I just want to make a brief comment on the on Richard's remarks relating to a capex-driven strategy that the government has followed. I just want to highlight the fourth quarter numbers, that GDP numbers that came end of last month. Of course, the eventual decline was lower than what was anticipated, but that's a difference of about 70 basis points. I'm not going to, make a big thing about it. But one key point that I would say is, if you open the hood, if you will, and look at some specifics of the components of GDP, I think there's some very good evidence for the philosophy of the capital expenditure driven recovery that the government has pursued. Firstly, if you look at the gross fixed capital formation in the economy in the fourth quarter, the gross fixed capital formation increased by almost 30%. Almost 30% year on year. So now do remember that this is basically being compared to the March 2020 quarter versus the March 2021 quarter, close to a 30% increase, precisely 28.4% increase. As a result, the ratio of the gross fixed capital formation to GDP, which when India was growing at high, close to 8% growth rates, had started touching 37-38%, hit 34%, was in excess of 34%, 34.3% to be precise. And this is crucial because this was the highest in the last 26 quarters. So more than 6 years, highest in the last, more than 6 years. And, a reasonable proportion of this was private capex as well. Of course, a lot of it was government capex. So now, what were the spillover effects that happened just in the fourth quarter, and what are the spillover effects that will come, going forward? Let me talk about that. The two key spillover effects that manifested was one, consumption after having declined for 3 quarters because of the both the pandemic-induced restrictions and the pandemic-induced risk aversion, grew by 2.7% in the fourth quarter. So that's the first positive spillover effect that got created. Secondly, the contact-sensitive sectors, which have been affected across the world, because of the pandemic, and the fact that the contact-sensitive sectors, are most intensively impacted by the restrictions, economic restrictions, and therefore had declined in high double digits, in the previous 3 quarters, declined by only 2.3% in the fourth quarter, and that is also quite important to sort of thereby illustrate the linkages that are there at the macroeconomic level from investment onto consumption and service sector activity as well. The other key point couple of other points that I want to mention, because one tends to hear a lot of very, very negative views about the economy. And I will mention that, when the first quarter numbers had come, when the decline was close to 25%, at that time, I had indeed predicted that there's a V-shaped recovery that is on in the economy, and that is indeed what has transpired. The reason I'm actually saying this is to suggest that during times of uncertainty, assessments that are more to the left tail, very negative, are ones that are actually far more acceptable to most people. Even balanced assessments are oftentimes seen to be optimistic. And Daniel Kahneman in his book actually attributes this to two inherent biases that we as humans suffer from. One is basically the ambiguity aversion and risk aversion, as a result of which actually, during times of uncertainty, anything that is balanced also actually, seems more optimistic, and we tend to actually believe the herded assessment or the herd assessment of far more negative projected outcomes. The second is what Kahneman calls saliency bias, which is that most of us tend to just look at the most recent observations and thereby extrapolate from there. I think in this context, I must mention, that the comparison with the global financial crisis, because that was the last crisis we know, and therefore there is a saliency bias there, which we must acknowledge, is actually something that we have to be a little bit more careful about. The key distinction I would make is crises that originate in the real sector versus crises that originate in the financial sector. There's a lot of research that shows that crises that originate in the financial sector, the overhang of that is far more long drawn. The impact of that is much greater, while crises that originate in the real sector are typically ones where the impact is not as long drawn. And I think while because we're amidst the pandemic and the recovery has happened, but I think in order to illustrate it, let me just contrast the recession that happened in the United States, for instance, after the tech crash, the technology crash in the early 2000s, versus the global financial crisis about a decade later. You saw how the recovery was much sharper after the tech crisis, but the recovery across the world has been much slower following the global financial crisis. While this is one anecdote, there's a lot of very, very large sample evidence backing this point as well. And I think that's something which is important when we think about FDI as well. Whatever assessments that are made for the performance of FDI following the global financial crisis may not be appropriate to extrapolate onto the effects of the pandemic itself. I think that's a caution that we must keep in mind. But to go back to my original point, therefore, that the assessment that was made at that time of a V-shaped recovery indeed transpired, and that assessment came about because one was careful to not be afflicted by the saliency bias or the biases of risk aversion and ambiguity aversion. I think this is important when we actually think about FDI going forward. While I want to actually talk about the reforms and the recovery process, I do want to make a couple of observations on FDI itself. And I think especially in the Indian context, the fact that India has recorded the highest growth in FDI amidst a global situation where FDI has shrunk by about 50 odd percent, I think, for the emerging economies. That's what the number I saw Richard presenting, I think is something which is very important, because this is a case of money putting its mouth, where its mouth is, money being put where the mouth is. And I think FDI and FPI are certainly examples of that. Yes, of course, I think the M&A versus the versus greenfield projects, actually that distinction is pertinent, is salient. But I think the fact that the same M&A did not happen as much in other countries, but is indicative of the India story. And I think that's what I want to actually really expand upon. Among all large economies, India is the only country that has done a slew of reforms in the last 1.5 years, and especially focused on removing a lot of the supply side frictions. Every other economy's intervention or package that you see is just is focused only on the demand side. But emerging economies like India and other emerging economies typically suffer from a lot of financial frictions, and which a lot of supply side frictions, in particular financial frictions, are actually one part of that. A lot of supply side frictions, and as Say's law says, supply actually eventually creates its own demand, and that is basically, you know, Say's law. But India is the only country that has done a slew of reforms, and I want to just enumerate that without going into detail. The labor reforms, the agricultural reforms, the change in MSME definitions to avoid the phenomenon of dwarfism, and most importantly, the enterprise policy focused on the private sector. And I think this is where the path for future FDI must be understood in the context of the enterprise policy focused on the private sector. The 2020 economic survey, the theme of that was ethical wealth creation. For most people in advanced economies, especially those that, you know, in the US, and having lived in the US for a decade, I can actually share that the American dream is about wealth creation. And so for most Americans, you know, thinking about wealth as a bane is something that they're not accustomed to at all. But given our socialistic past, actually, you know, we've had this baggage of wealth and wealth creation itself being seen as a bane and not necessarily as a boon. But if we look at the articulation of that idea that ethical wealth creation is really critical to India's growth in the reforms, then you see there's a huge change in mindset, you know, that has been displayed. And this is important because it actually illustrates the political economy, you know, and the fact that the political establishment has actually shown the conviction to really embrace, you know, the role of the private sector, the efficiencies provided by private sector in economic growth. Words like privatization and asset monetization were never used in any government document. The budget speech by the Honorable Finance Minister this year used the word privatization. You know, in earlier government communication, the word that was used was the euphemism of disinvestment. In contrast, that's been replaced with privatization. So as India really emphasizes private sector, the role of private sector, FDI will become, you know, more and more, you know, will have a big role to play, because you know, FDI can really bring those efficiency gains that can be generated by the private sector. A couple of observations, especially for, you know, in the context of FDI, in a country like India, with such a large you know, workforce, and you know, and a large population of a young population, you know, one of the key objectives that multinationals must focus on is to ensure that capital and labor are complementing each other. And I think when one looks at overall macroeconomic level, that is indeed true. But I think even in the particular sector, if FDI actually comes in, you know, with the idea that we can make labor more efficient and thereby also increase total factor productivity, I think the idea that only replacing capital with labor can enhance total factor productivity is not something that actually is, you know, is really so beneficial for you know, multinationals in the long run. And here I think what is really important is for multinationals to understand the difference between, you know, what is privately optimal and what is socially optimal, or optimal for everybody as a group, multinationals as a group. If multinationals as a group themselves are seen to create more jobs or are not seen to displace jobs, then in a democratic polity like India, the buy-in for you know, for more reforms towards FDI would be much greater. And I think, you know, in any democratic polity, actually, it is really critical for economic actors to actually keep this in mind, that the you know, it's all you know, good to say that that politics and economics are different. No, in a democratic polity, I think the two have to go together, and therefore economic actors that are visionary enough to actually keep, you know, internalize some of these aspects are the ones that actually, you know, are there for the long run. And I think that's one key idea that I must emphasize. A related aspect is also where FDI can play a huge role. I talked about the phenomenon of dwarfism among the small and medium enterprises. And I think here, if multinationals can really encourage their suppliers, the small firms, that, you know, and if they, you know, and maybe customers that are small and medium enterprises, to grow and thereby reap economies of scale. And I think that can help their suppliers or their customers who are SMEs to be able to compete better in the global markets. The benefit will come to the multinationals as well, because economies of scale will reduce costs, and therefore the multinational will also benefit from such cost reduction among the small and medium enterprises. So the last 2 points actually are finally about basically about leadership. And I want to leave with that thought that there's always the opportunity to say X is doing doing a certain thing, and therefore use that as a justification for one to do the same thing. But leadership is when 99.9% of people do one thing, but the 0.1% leaders have the conviction, the courage of conviction to say, okay, we will try and internalize this benefit and thereby do something that actually which is create jobs and thereby also help SMEs to grow, so that the buy-in for FDI itself actually also increases, so that we create a bigger pie. Therefore we have there's more for not only us, but also for for those the stakeholders with whom we are working with. And I think that vision is extremely important for multinationals to be to benefit in the long run through FDI. After all, actually this is this has to be a symbiotic relationship between the stakeholders in that work with multinationals for FDI to really prosper in India. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Subramaniam, for a very insightful, very candid, keynote address. You have highlighted how India is trying to revive and recover the, this economy through capex-driven strategy, which has shown results, and some more spillovers of that are becoming obvious as we go along. And what is very heartening to note is that the gross capital formation rate rose up to 34% after so many years of declining. I think this is a very, very good news. And of course, the last points that you made, emphasizing on the symbiotic relationship between different stakeholders, MSMEs, the large Indian companies, and multinational companies, is what we should be aiming to exploit fully. And this is the way forward for India's recovery, which is sustainable, which is more inclusive and resilient. Now, I know that you have another commitment at 4 o'clock. So I want to, before I invite the two distinguished panelists, I want to open it up briefly for any burning questions before you leave the meeting. So one I see on the screen, but I want to just check if there are other colleagues wanting to make a question or ask a question to you before you leave. Are there any hands? Could I see any hands on the screen? If none, then at this stage, I think there is a question in the chat, which I read out to you, Dr. Subramaniam, and maybe you begin to answer that. So what are the prospects of leveraging FDI for achieving the objectives of Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat programs? Much of the FDI inflows to India last year was into services, especially telecommunications. How can more FDI be attracted to the manufacturing sector? I think this is a very good question. And now I see a hand raised by Professor Ananya. So maybe we collect a couple of questions and then you could answer together. There are more questions coming on the chat box. So may I invite Professor Ananya to make a question to you? Yes, Ananya goes to
Yes, thank you so much. So I had a question for you, Dr. Subramaniam, a couple in fact. One is regarding the recovery process for private investments. Because, as a macroeconomist, while government investment does crowd in private investment, but it's really private investment which typically leads growth. That's one question. And the second, it's so interesting, you should talk about financial crisis being different from real crisis. And as Reinhardt and Rogoff have actually pointed out in there, this time is different, that, it's the kind of financial crisis one is talking about. So if it's a stock market crisis, maybe we needn't be that worried. But if it's a banking crisis, then that could be a whole different ballgame. So to what extent are we looking at the nexus between the housing market, which has been depressed in India, and the nexus between, housing loans and the banking crisis? Because, that's what the subprime has taught us, that financial crisis, especially banking crisis, which can be vicious, the seeds of a banking crisis can actually lie in the housing market. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And these are the two questions I had for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ananya. The next question is on the screen, actually, by Mr. Ashwini Gupta, which says that how much of a challenge it is to maintain a delicate balance between attracting FDI and Atmanirbhar Bharat policy. So maybe Dr. Chandrasekhar, Dr. Subramaniam, I'm so sorry. You could begin answering these three questions or four questions, and then we'll see.
Yeah, let me first answer Professor Ananya's question. Your first point, I quite agreed with. So I don't have any additional aspect to add. The second point on, of course, I think, everybody's, at least academics are familiar with Reinhardt and Rogoff. But, I don't want this to become a dialogue between you and me. There's a much larger audience here who would get sort of tuned off to some of these more academic discussions. I think the broad point as a takeaway for the audience is that when the crisis originates in the financial sector, and when we say the financial sector, that is banks, financial intermediaries. Do remember that the stock market is eventually for the real sector because of the firms that go and raise equity. So in that sense, a little different. So when it originates basically from in the financial sector, the crisis is much more long drawn. That's the point that Professor Ananya was making, and I think that point is absolutely well taken. Again, I don't see a question there. It's a comment that I actually again agree with. As for the question that has come from who was the question? I think it was Professor Ashwini, Professor Ashwini, on the balance between FDI and and Atmanirbhar Bharat. See, and I think this is something which has to be understood very well. Atmanirbhar is actually is self-reliance. The Hindi word Atmanirbhar actually translates into self-reliance. We should not make the mistake of thinking about Atmanirbhar as self-sufficiency. There's a big difference between self-reliance and self-sufficiency. Let me, because of paucity of time, I will not have, I can give you a very detailed answer to this. But let me say the following, that show me a self-reliant individual, and I'll show you a capable individual. Show me a self-reliant company, and I'll show you a capable company. In other words, or said differently, I don't think you'll find a self-reliant individual who's not capable, who has intrinsic capabilities, or a self-reliant company that is not capable. The same is true for countries as well. The idea of self-reliance is actually to ensure not self-sufficiency, but to ensure that capabilities actually in areas that are absolutely essential are developed. That's the spirit with which, otherwise, if you look at actually as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat policies, FDI norms have actually been relaxed. In so many sectors, you just saw in the budget 74%, increase of FDI to the insurance sector. In 2019, August, September of 2019, there were a lot of other relaxations that happened as well. So if you interpret Atmanirbhar as self-sufficiency, the pre-1991 strategy of just basically Robinson Crusoe staying in an island and actually cutting himself off from the rest of the world, that paradigm actually is possibly one of self-sufficiency, which actually we know very well, how that went. This paradigm is of self-reliance, and self-reliance actually is always built, requires capabilities, and capabilities, I'm sure all of you understand, is built through competition. Without adequate competition, you don't become, capable. You have to go and test yourself with the best to be capable. So I don't think there is any, there's any sort of opposition or conflict in the, in enhancing FDI and Atmanirbhar Bharat. As for your, the first question, and I'm actually just not remembering what was the first question. If you could just quickly
the question was about this. FDI is largely going to services sector, while Make in India, requires them to go to manufacturing.
So how do we encourage more FDI in manufacturing sector? See, I think, it'll be useful for our audience to recognize that, there have been a lot of policy measures that have already been taken, to really invigorate the manufacturing sector. In fact, if you look at the policy emphasis over the last 1.5 to 2 years, the emphasis has been on the primary and secondary sectors of the economy. So, if you split the, the economy into just from a sector, primary, secondary, and tertiary, services is basically tertiary activity. Manufacturing is more, is secondary, while agriculture is primary activity. The emphasis of reforms has been on the primary and the secondary sector. So, labor reforms. Why is labor reform so important? Because, labor is actually very important for the manufacturing sector. Similarly, MSMEs actually, are a big player, a disproportionate role in the manufacturing sector, and therefore, ensuring that we give them the incentives to grow, thereby utilize economies of scale and make themselves capable to be able to compete in the global markets, and at the same time compete well domestically as well, with multinational. I think that is also a very important change, and the entire policy on enterprise policy on private sector. These are all really about enabling in more investments into manufacturing. The export PLI scheme, 13 champion sectors, many of those are towards manufacturing. So the reason we've actually focused so much on manufacturing is because this is one sector that can really generate a lot of jobs in the organized sector. And eventually, if you think about it, there is no better form of social and economic inclusion for an individual and a family than a job in the organized sector. And that is why we've actually emphasized manufacturing so much. All these will definitely bring more FDI. I'll just leave with this observation. If you look at the manufacturing sector, the Purchasing Managers Index, ever since September, when the unlock phase after the first wave began, manufacturing PMI has been actually hitting record levels, record of over the last 6-7 years. And even in the month of May, amidst the second wave, it was still in expansionary zone. I think that tells you the kind of emphasis that we've placed on manufacturing in terms of policy, and the the benefits of those actually fructifying on the ground as well, which is good news for FDI in the manufacturing sector. Thank you very much. I must run, and so I really thank the organizers for providing me this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Subramaniam, for not only giving us a very erudite and very scintillating keynote address, but also taking some questions despite many demands on your time. So we are very, very grateful of this, your very precious time. We will be in touch with you. And I know that you have to leave now. So we will move over to the rest of the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. So friends, yeah, thank you. Friends, now we move to the next part of the program with our distinguished panelists, Professor Manoj Pant and Mr. Deepak Bagla. So Manoj, are you there?
I'm here.
Yes, Manoj, so you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Nagesh. And first of all, thank you for inviting me for this discussion. Also to Richard and UNCTAD. Without UNCTAD, we wouldn't even know what's happening to FDI. They're the only guys who are doing the really difficult job of collecting, collating, and comparing data on FDI. It's a horrendous job. And in the media, FDI is talked about so much in India, but people are very confused because they don't know what they're talking about. They keep switching between FDI and FII. And, one day UNCTAD takes out the volume to remove the confusions about what is and what is not FDI. What I'll do is very quickly in the next 10 minutes or so, let me just pick up a couple of key points that the report makes. See, let's talk about 4 issues. There's FDI, of course. There's by the way, wonderful presentation, Richard. Really enjoyed it. One is FDI. The second is technology. Third issue I see sustainable development. And one which I think is very important, but sort of get back, trade. And an underlying theme which they have highlighted is supply chains, right? Let me link these things. Now, the first of all, the report mentions that this time the FDI has been more, that there is a worry because FDI is in the form of M&As and not greenfield. I don't know why that is so worrying. I'll tell you why. This is not the first time. Please go back to your own UNCTAD publications of say 2001, 2002, which picked up this trend. That FDI was taking the form of M&As and not greenfield. And I'll tell you why it's not surprising, not rocket science. There's no conspiracy to take over the world on this. It is very simple. And that comes because of the known, at least literature, link between FDI and technology. Technology is FDI is basically looking for ways to source either inputs or source the outputs which are led by technology. Now, once FDI and technology are linked, then the reason why FDI it takes the form of M&As is because the technology obsolescence has been increasing dramatically. The obsolescence in technology is so rapid, maybe 4 years, 5 years, that frankly, no one has time for a greenfield investment. So the only place where you will find greenfield investment happening, if you want to call it in terms of replicating, is, for example, what I call branches. McDonald's goes somewhere, and they have done studies to show replication is the best way of expanding the market rather than expanding. But here, in the context of FDI, particularly in the context of manufacturing, which is what the report is all about, it's largely not surprising that FDI and M&As are, there's nothing to worry about. It is the nature of technology to make sure that the link between FDI and M&A will not change. And therefore, possibility of greenfield investment is defined as not going to happen in the near future. Now, my problem is the second point, the worry about FDI and sustainable development. Now, here is my problem. Sustainable development, whether you talk in terms of the areas that you have mentioned in your report, you say you're worried about the decline, right, in FDI. When you talk about health sector or the other sector, agriculture, education, etc. Now, one thing which I think I didn't read it because I did read the report quite seriously, I didn't see a reference to climate change. To be the most game-changing aspect of the 21st century is going to be climate change. And this pandemic, if anything, it is going to renew focus on climate change. Now, why is it important? Climate change, like many of the other sustainable developments, are basically public goods. And FDI is a private activity. Now, FDI is not going to promote sustainable development. It's not supposed to. Private goods do not support public goods. Private sector is not supposed to. What matters, and that's where Mr. Subramaniam rightly pointed out, the Indian government and other governments, the US governments focus on infrastructure, which is the critical issue as far as diverting investment into sustainable development goals. It is for the governments to give the indication through their expenditure on infrastructure. Because you cannot expect private sector to suddenly promote sustainable development goals. That's not their job. And theory, we know private sector does not go into public goods. So I think the special focus on infrastructure which governments will make, and which the pandemic is forcing them to make, whether it's health in India or infrastructure, other physical infrastructure in US, is what will guide it, and you will see the link happening. But I don't see why again, that's an issue of money. Now, here is something which I will talk about because I spent, I think, most of my academic life talking about it. Even wrote about my book, FDI in India, History, Policy, and Asian Perspective. I have a whole chapter devoted to it. Our problem is that we don't see, and you have a section, though you don't stress that enough. You don't stress enough on the fact that FDI and trade are not two different things. You know, Krugman in one of his papers long back pointed this out. Professor Batra, my guide, talked about it in a paper in AER long back. Basically, FDI is, or if you want to call it TNC movement, is another way of doing trade. What does FDI do? It combines the three elements of manufacturing, services, and the third, technology. Without technology, there is no logic for FDI. Why would anyone invest so much effort into a fixed resource, into fixed cost of putting up FDI if you might as well trade? So FDI and trade have a natural link. And in my book, I have shown that you can take any set of countries, as many as you want to, except in the case of tax havens, there's a one-to-one correspondence between bilateral FDI and bilateral trade. Now, the issue of whether trade and FDI are substitute complements is a different issue, but the fact remains these two go together. And governments still look at them in silos. Someone talks FDI is someone's baby, and trade is someone. I'm simply making the point, you cannot do one without the other because they're the same thing. It's like saying, I'll only take a coin with a head. But if there's a coin with a head, there has to be tail. One day you turn it over, you'll see the tail. And that's the mistake. I wish the World Investment Report would highlight this aspect. There are well-known theoretical work on this. I have done some myself. But there's a lot of empirical ones to show. And the empirical data shows that FDI and trade actually are complements. And India is the best example. Look at where our exports go, dominant. Those also where our FDI goes. Despite all the efforts by this BRICS and all that, Indian FDI goes into the same areas where we, and which sector doesn't go into software? But that's where we tend to export, and infrastructure, that's also what we export. So trade and FDI are linked. The only difference missing part is technology. And that is where I think I can understand why FDI in India has improved so much in recent years. And some good friends of mine who say, no, government, what is this? They are claiming FDI has increased so much. Actually, it's FII. Actually, both have increased. Because FDI has a component called retained earnings, which is a part of FII. And therefore, FDI and FII can both increase, can both decrease, and have no relation to each other because of a component called retained earnings, which is not a financial flow. So if you look at it, the financial flow aspect is what makes something only FII, but the controlling factor, the 10% equity plus retained earnings, is what makes FDI. So let's be very clear. So did the unfortunate thing, I guess, is today everyone, when you talk about anything, has to talk about the pandemic. If you don't, in my April 18th article of 2020 in the Mint, I had said, purely analytically, that any recovery has to be V-shaped. It was long back, so anyone can please check April 18th, 2020 in the Mint. I said it has to be V-shaped. Simple logic. The recession has not been caused by economic factors. So why are economists looking for economic factors? It's a fear factor. If someone is scared in the dark, you can give any incentive, but they will not go to see a horror movie. Or If someone is scared that they're going to die of cancer, it doesn't matter how much money you give them, they're not going to spend more because they're gone. Now they're going to save. So let's save, keep the pandemic aside. I believe FDI has retreated as it always does after any drop in trade. And in a couple more years, if trade recovers, trade recovery is the critical part, and I'm going to end with one last part, the supply chain. Here is where I think it's important to understand what this WIR brings out. You know, supply chain is something that we have learned for many years in academia. We call it intra-industry. We call it intra-industry trade. But people don't understand intra-industry trade. They know supply chain, the same thing. What it says is, you don't know country makes a product of its own. So Atmanirbhar, as Kelly rightly said, Vishnumoorthy rightly said, Atmanirbhar means I'll make what I can make, I'll import what I can't make. And no country's ever made a product which says only made by us. The two ones I always give examples of is Malaysia and Proton car that they decided to make about 7-8 years ago. It was quickly given up and it was a failure. And the Indian one, for reasons of legal issues, I will not mention this forum, but we all know which car was made supposed to be 100% Indian and been a disaster. So FDI, when we talk about the issue of FDI and supply chains, that's the point. To demystify the fact that FDI is not necessarily a big firm issue. Supply chain is not a big firm issue. All small companies, major exporters in Switzerland, Taiwan, and again I will say in places like South Korea, are small firms. It is the biggest export unit of exporting units of Switzerland, for example, are small firms, not large firms. And that is where the supply chain argument is so critical to emphasize, how this is the only way that you take the small sector along with the large sector. Instead of saying them versus us, large versus small, small versus large, I think if you realize that the two have a symbiotic relationship through supply chain, then these political arguments slowly disappear. And the biggest example of that, of course, is car parts. Automobile, we have resisted imports or exports of automobiles, but we have become world's largest exporters of parts. And this is typically because these parts are made by smaller producers. And I'll end with the last thing. I know there's a section on this, but you must stress a lot more on what people have called the literature on FDI and spillovers. And the reason why I say that is not because spillover is something new, but what evidence shows, empirical evidence. I've done so much in the past on this, so many PhDs. Spillovers happen only for one reason: learning by doing. You don't actually steal a technology like the Japanese all used to do in the 50s, or you steal a blueprint or buy a blueprint. Those are not the kinds of way you get technology. The best way is learning by doing. And the biggest example is training of labor. Foreign companies which come train labor, that trained labor then becomes a source of external available labor for some other firm, and they tend to move to other firms. So the role of FDI in creating spillover factors through learning by doing is something worth noting. And last to end, once again, thank you for this excellent only source of FDI that at least those who work in FDI have. I would say that I'm sure you have done it, but the priorities for investment have to be trade priorities investment. And they will automatically become FDI. It's not as if investment priorities are different from trade, they are the same. You will never make any FDI come into India in sectors where we are not major importers or exporters. Not going to happen. As I said, these are two sides of the same coin. So I believe at some point in time, UNCTAD should bring out something which stresses this and tells governments, please don't treat this in different silos. There is one country which does that today, and that's why they've been so successful, Singapore. I think I'll end with that, and whatever any questions I'm happy to answer. But I enjoyed it. It's a wonderful report. And thank you once again for the only source of information that we have.
Thank you, Manoj, especially for highlighting the intimate relationship between trade and FDI, which actually defines how FDI delivers its developmental impacts. I think we'll come back to you. Now it's time for me to invite Mr. Deepak Bagla, whom I introduced in the beginning. as the Chief Executive Officer of Invest India, the investment promotion agency of India. So over to you, Mr. Bagla.
Thank you, Nagesh. Thank you really for getting us all together. Very interesting. And I know it's been a bit of a long afternoon, but very, very scintillating points. And as always, I have to thank Richard and his team. I mean, we always wait for this report, and it is actually now the main report which the entire world goes by. In fact, Richard, I was with James earlier in India's morning on a roundtable on the report itself. And I must thank James and you again, and also because that's, I know last year you had judged Invest India as the world's #1 investment promotion agency. And this morning also has judged Invest India as the most innovative investment promotion agency in the world. And James was a part of that. So thank you again. We've had a lot of discussions on the FDI bit, the global part of it, etc., and some parts on India. And Professor Pant was very eloquent on trade and investment going together. And I completely agree with all the points. Let me just stick myself and share with you some of my own experiences specific to India on FDI. So one is obviously James' report very well points out that the world FDI went down by 35%. India's share went up by 27%. And I must also say their report is January to December. So even if I look at our report, which is April to March, we've got similar statistics on that one. While the world went down by about 35-40%, our share was up by 20%. But let me give you some more interesting points on that one. And that's what I want to say, why I think this number, not just only because it's unprecedented, because in such a time, it has gone up in the most challenging times. And as I see it, we are probably one of the only 3 or 4 big countries which has actually been able to increase its stake, even in the toughest of challenges. And there's a reason why that is happening. But before I come to that reason, let me just share with you a few details. We've got this number across 63 sectors. Now, this is very important. Broadening the sectoral base and composition where we are receiving FDI. If I had done this exercise about 5 years ago, you would have seen this was about 20 odd sectors. Today, we are looking at 63 sectors in which I have received FDI. And this is a very strong trend. Please understand, this is also a trend which will show you which are the sectors which are emerging. And a large number of new sectors are emerging, household equipment, agricultural machinery is on the rise. So anyone who says that it was only based on IT, etc., not really. The base is broadening considerably with a very clear trend attached to it, showing that we've got now a larger capacity across these sectors, not only to absorb capital, but also to attract capital. And that is where each of these sectors is now beginning to come up the curve on being competitive. The second very interesting one, and this was very heartening. We received FDI this time from 89 countries. Nagesh, that's a big number. I mean, you may have a few friends, which were the typically 5 or 6 countries, which would have accounted for most of your FDI. This year, we've got 89 different countries. And what that speaks of is that the voice of India is now reaching many more boardrooms than ever before. And it's across the globe. That is very critical because a large number of them could be green shoots. I mean, I could see a Colombia, I could see a Samoa, I could see a Kenya, a number of them, Kenya was there even earlier. But you're seeing these green shoots coming up very significantly. And that is what, when we are talking of sustainability of FDI, it doesn't remain a single trick pony either within a sector or within a country. And that makes it far more sustainable as we are looking at a little longer trend going forward. And now to tell you something which is closest to my heart and which to my belief is one of the most positive signs. This time I got FDI in 29 states of India. This is very critical for everyone. You've had 6 or 7 or 8 states which were always ruling the roost and taking it all away. And you know, when you look at this 29 states of India which got FDI, I mean, Arunachal Pradesh, Ladakh, Jammu Kashmir, I mean, there is a reason why that is happening. And to my mind, one of the primary reasons of the big change which is happening in India at such a fast pace, please don't forget, what we are experiencing today is the most unprecedented change in human history, both in terms of the scale at which it is happening in the free world and the pace at which that change is happening. And all these numbers of FDI, don't just go by the number. FDI is a question of trust. FDI is people across the globe are willing to put their money where they see that it is important, and that is where the tomorrow is going to be better than today. It is that trust which comes out in these numbers and this bar race. And let me give you an interesting point. One of the biggest movements happening in India, and to my mind, which we don't talk about enough, is the ease of doing business competition between states. Good economics today is the center of good politics. And each of these state governments is moving at a huge pace just so that they can change and make ease of doing business as the center point to attract investments. Let me give you some points. Look at Uttar Pradesh. From 2015 to 2019, jumped from position 10 to 2. 8 positions jumped. Lakshadweep from 33 to 15, 18 positions. Daman and Diu, 33 to 18, 15 positions. Uttarakhand, amazing story, 23 to 11. Himachal from 17 to 7, Telangana from 13 to 3. I mean, the list goes on. And that is what explains that today I'm in a position where I am ready to attract foreign investment and I'm ready to absorb the capital of foreign investment. My absorptive capacity of capital today is much higher than ever before because I am far more broadened than I ever was before. These are very critical points. Please understand, it goes where there is trust. It goes where there is opportunity. And the last point is, it goes where it gets a good return on its capital. And that's where we get the ease of doing business part coming in. You know, we talk about the PLI schemes, and I will. And you had Dr. Subramaniam also speak about some of the ease of doing measures. While the entire world was busy with the pandemic, and so were we. Let's face it, it's unprecedented. And there is no playbook by which you can work on this one. You know, you have to take it the day at a time. In fact, 12 hours at a time, because you don't know how this virus is turning. And yet you had some of those economic statistics which came by. And let me give you one example. These were studies which just gave back to me. And why I bring that to you, and I'm jumping from one to the other on that, Nagesh, because we have shortage of time. I want to move to the MSMEs. I look at that as the engine of growth of India. The new India which emerges out of this COP, and I'm not just talking because of work from home, that means work from anywhere, which is true. And after this, I will come back to the point on supply chains, which Professor Pant mentioned, and so did the other speakers. Very interesting, 3 studies. The first study was by Dun & Bradstreet. It said 82%, and this is only for MSMEs. Guys, I'm reading this out for you. 82% respondents said that they had digitized their daily operations during the pandemic, which helped them in reducing their cost by 54% and enhanced their competitiveness by 51%. Let me give you another study by HP. 73% SMEs said they would survive the COVID downturn in comparison to an average of 60% SMEs of Asia. We were 73, Asia was 60. And very interestingly on that one, 61% felt they would thrive in their operations in the post-COVID world. Very interesting, very important. And let me come to the point on that one. Why I believe that the MSMEs are going to take it forward. Because what do you require in the new world as we move out of this COVID is businesses which are resilient, which are nimble, which are very good in frugal innovation and capital utilization, and at the same time can pivot their business models fast. And nobody better than our MSMEs and our innovation and our startups. I will not go into details. I think that is very well understood. And let me take you. Do we have time for something else? Or are we done, Nagesh? 1 minute. Well, then if it is 1 minute, then I'll just let it be. But I do want to let you know that there is a very strong sense to see why India is becoming a centerfold where FDI is concerned. And our ease of doing business is also reducing their costs. There was a quick point, and this will be my last point because I do want to mention that. Professor Pant mentioned about, acquisitions versus greenfield. One, during a closed economy, you cannot do a greenfield. I mean, there was no way during this time you could do a greenfield, and that's why we say it happened. But acquisitions greenfield start in FDI start taking greater momentum as a country moves up the economic ladder and ease of doing business, where the construction risk and the execution risks starts becoming down. And that is what we've already started seeing. So people start moving, especially global investors, from acquisitions to greenfields, and you've already started seeing that movement happen where India is concerned. Let me take it back to you, and I don't want to exceed my time. Thank you, Nagesh.
Thank you, Mr. Bagla. I think it was very interesting. First of all, let me congratulate you on this award that Invest India has received successively in the second year. Of course, it speaks volumes about the dynamism that Invest India is showing in attracting more and more investments to India. But what you have highlighted is very interesting, that broadening of the composition of FDI coming to India. So many sectors now, which were earlier not attracting any FDI, are attracting. FDI is coming from a larger set of sources, and it is also going to almost all the states. So I think this absorptive capacity of India in terms of absorbing FDI across whole set of or whole gamut of sectors and bringing it to all different locations or the geographies in the country is a very important observation. And I know that many of my colleagues are working on the geography of industry and economic activity. They would find this observation to be very relevant to pursue further. And the last point that you made about MSMEs being the engines of India's growth and how they are becoming, they are catching up with the technology and also the frugal innovations that they drive. It's all very interesting. I think we had, I'm sure everyone agrees that we had a very rich discussion in this last, some 90 minutes. I want to just, we have only a few minutes left. I want to just ask around if anybody wants to make a burning question, and I see a couple of hands straight away going up. So, Mr. Nalin Bharti, can you just be very quick and sharp, and then Sanjay Malik. So, and with that, we will close this discussion because, of course, we have to. Yeah. Nalin, can you
Thank
go?
You.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
My question is very much connected with the US-China trade war and the FDI, increasing FDI inflow in India. What connection basically panelists and the speakers today finds between the current US-China trade war and the increasing FDI inflow in India?
Okay, then Sanjay, and then Chandra Chopra. So with that, yes, Sanjay, go ahead.
Yes, sir. I appreciate the I enjoyed all the presentation and discussion as well. I'll make a quick question. Since there is people around, they will ask the question. But I have only one thing, sir. The day I started working on FDI, I know that there is a two country. They are known as tax haven. That is Mauritius and Singapore. They have been all the investment there. I think even right now also currently also around 50% investment FDI is coming from Mauritius and Singapore. If you go to the FDI statistics, I am going by that only. But I started working on FDI in 2009, but still that time also these two countries have the largest share, almost 50%. Still now it is major share, and what I understood from the literature, that is called the round tripping. The Indian investors, they are investing through Mauritius and Singapore. So how do you explain that, or do you think that we should celebrate that We should not celebrate. That is one question. Second thing, that that you are celebrating that. This question is to the Mr. Deepak Bagala. So that the FDI is always it is always broadened. It is always 63 only. Earlier, if you see the previous year, it is 63. But you see that all the FDI is coming fraction in infinitesimally quantity in coming to all the sector. You cannot celebrate that. That is my question. The two questions.
Okay. Thank you, Sanjay. Now, Chanchal Chopra,
Yes.
Dr. Chanchal Chopra. Quickly, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. My question is that during the pandemic period, FDI decreased by 66% in human capital, and it increased by 24% in ICT. This is a very unfavorable situation, and the period during which huge imports were made into health sector, according to Professor Pant, FDI should have also increased in the health sector during this period, but it declined so much. So I would just like to know what can be done to enhance FDI in the health sector.
All right. Thank you very much, Chanchal and Nalin and Sanjay, for your questions. If there are no other hands, then I would like to go back to, I see one Radha Raghuram. So go ahead quickly, please.
Good evening, sir. My question is especially FDI in agri-processing and rural infrastructure, because we have seen that agriculture sector is the first sector which has recovered post-pandemic after the first wave. So what's your view on FDI in agri-infrastructure? Next, FDI with respect to digitalization in the logistics and supply chain sector, because this is one change we have seen post-pandemic, more of digitalization. So FDI in the digital infrastructure with respect to logistics and supply chain. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So with that, I want to go back to our speakers, Richard, Manoj, and Deepak, to answer any one of these questions that is posed, and make a one sentence closing remark. And with that, we will come to the end of this. So may I begin with Richard? You have heard a number of speakers from India. I'm sure you have something to share or respond to, and any closing remarks so from your side.
Thank you very much. It's been an extremely interesting session. I'm very happy to have listened in and heard some views from India. What I'll try and do in this closing moments is I'll try and address one or two of the questions I heard. So first of all, on the first question related to the trade war and the shift of investment to India, that would indicate that you would see additional investment flows in India in export-oriented manufacturing, with exports going to the United States and other developed country markets. Greenfield investment worldwide has been fairly weak over the past 5 or even longer, over the past 5 years. Now, we've tried to analyze this. We've seen some investment diversion as a result of the trade war to other Asian countries, more to ASEAN rather than to India, to be honest. It's very difficult to analyze. We will look at this further. I think it is more emblematic than anything else, emblematic from the perspective that it is signaling changes in international policy stance towards foreign direct investment that we looked at in great detail in last year's World Investment Report, and try to analyze the expected impacts on international production and investment in international production networks. So I would refer to that. I'm trying to be brief and cover the different questions. I had trouble following the question on Singapore and Mauritius, but I think just a few words on this. I mean, clearly, my earlier comments in my presentation about some of the declines in foreign direct investment flows being accentuated or inflated by big shifts in investment through conduit economies is relevant here. Of course, this also applies to some extent for Singapore, and Mauritius. What is interesting there is the effect it has on intra-regional investment flows, right? Of course, I know Mauritius has a specific significance for outward flows from India, but just focusing on intra-regional, I mean, there is a big expectation in the post-pandemic investment environment that regional or intra-regional investment will increase across the world. Some of that at the moment, as we analyze in our report this year, is a little bit overestimated as a result of these conduit economies, and Singapore and Mauritius are a big example of that. While trade is very much more regional, or global value chains are actually regional value chains, as we have shown in previous investment reports. But when you look at investment, it's not at all the case. Investment is much more global than regional in nature. So we have a section on that in our report this year, and you'll see the data on this. Then the question on the health sector. This is a very interesting question. We look at investment in health, looking at the entire health sector value chain, so including pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, medical equipment, but also hospital services, clinics, and health sector services. You need to look at all of this combined and look at the ecosystem for investment there in order to encourage effectively investment in the health sector. Investment in health services, which is what most people would tend to think about first, is much more rare than investment in the other parts of the value chain. And that is because health services, of course, have a public sector responsibility aspect to it. They're very much more regulated. Foreign involvement is more regulated. But it is increasing, and it has been increasing over the past few years. There are international hospital operators that are becoming much more active. And there are also, if I may call them this way, industrial policies pushing for investment in the health sector, including through special economic zones, or including through the combination of promoting investment in local health services with health tourism. So there are many options here available. I think I'll leave it to these three questions. And,
thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
You're most welcome. I'll leave it to these three questions. Thank you very much again for the invitation and for the opportunity for me to intervene here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard. You have taken virtually every question that was posed to the speakers. Thank you very much indeed. And now let me turn to Manoj and then to Deepak, and then we'll have a wrap up.
A quick wrap on the first issue, India FDI and US-China trade. I don't think the two are related at all. I mean, a researcher can check themselves. You look at the top 4 exports from China. We don't export any of those items. So you can't say they've shifted here, you're going to suddenly export billions and billions of dollars of automation, not going to happen, or office machinery, not going to happen. We are getting there, but electronic exports are not our biggest items. So that's not going to happen. I think what's happening is the lower end, already wage costs are going up in many of these countries. The lower end of many supply chains in terms of labor costs now shifting towards India. And that may be happening, and I think the government's encouragement of technology, they've done a lot on that, open technology, that's what explains it, rather than this US-China trade war. And frankly, I doubt this US-China trade war also, I think, is more on paper than actually in reality. Okay, next, tax haven. No, please don't call Singapore a tax haven. And on Mauritius, we look at the data. Ever since the direct tax treaty, the FDI from Mauritius declined. So that will be taken care of by itself. Please again use what I said. Look at the link between bilateral FDI and bilateral trade. And you will see Singapore is not a big manufacturing country, but they are services. Our major exports to Singapore come in services. Similarly, our imports from Singapore come in services. So it's not a tax haven. It is a tax haven in the sense that the corporate tax rate in Singapore is unknown. You know, they can call someone and say, okay, Nagesh, you are a great person and we think you have a great idea. For you, zero profit, zero tax. They can do that, but that's the different issue. But it is not a tax haven. So I think in Mauritius, I have already answered to you. In the case of HR, I think Richard gave you a very good answer. I can't improve on it. It is the area of services where some of the decline is taking place, not the hardware part, but actually there has been an increase. And in any case, you can't expect much increase in hardware in India because initially we were importers of hardware. Only later they became exporters. In services of health, the reason why FDI is not so much is also because of domestic regulatory issues. You know, we were wanting to export services from health, not import them. So although we do import actual hospital, but we don't. So that's not, it's a regulatory issue, it's not an FDI issue. Last, I'll quickly answer. FDI in agri-infrastructure versus digital. You know, agriculture infrastructure, FDI means what? What is agriculture infrastructure? The only item I can think of that FDI is permitted is warehousing. But warehousing doesn't make sense unless large firms, small firms don't use warehousing. So if you don't allow large firms in agriculture, you can't expect FDI to come into agriculture infrastructure. So these are two related. Regarding digitization, well, what is there to answer? I mean, very obvious. The whole world is digitizing. So anyone who sends any kind of equity or relation to any country must be investing in digitization.
Yeah.
I think I'll stop.
Okay, thank you, Manoj. So Deepak, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nagesh. I'll be quick. I know we're running out of time. So very quickly, let me give you statistics again. Before the start of the COVID, March 2020, my facilitation book was $80 billion. That means this is actually on the ground, okay, which we are handholding companies, about 570 of them. Today, it is 166 billion. Even in the lockdown, during the 12 months, it's doubled. And these are actual companies bringing it down. And why I mentioned this, Pradeep? Pradeep has raised his hand. Why I mentioned this, Nagesh, is because we have agriculture in that, we have logistics in that, we have healthcare, which is one of the fastest growing segments. And if you look at my entire Startup India, the funding maximum to startups is now going, one of the top sectors is healthcare. By the way, Invest India is also managers of Startup India. But before I end, Nagesh, let me give you some very quick statistics. We were talking about greenfield investments, and the source is Moody's Orbis database. Okay, this is the total number of greenfield projects to India, this is of last year, from all across the world. This is their data, this is not my data. Projects, greenfield projects, 333 to India, 55 to Indonesia, 91 to Malaysia, 62 to Thailand, 114 to Vietnam. And now from the US to these countries, last year, greenfield, 133 to India, 7 to Indonesia, 19 to Malaysia, 11 to Thailand, 15 to Vietnam. Regardless of what you might say, and we may think we are losing out to many others, I think India's story has just begun. And I've given you the numbers, and these trends are not just there to stay, but gain momentum. Thank you, Nagesh.
Thank you, Deepak. I think it's a very good point to conclude the this session of 90 minutes. I'm sure everyone will agree with me that these were very well spent 90 minutes we could have. And I won't venture or try to summarize what was a very rich discussion, because we heard so many viewpoints coming across. And in any case, we have run out of time. So I want to just use this occasion to thank all of our speakers, including Richard, who shared very crisp and rich insights from the World Investment Report, and answered the questions, which also highlight his deep insights into how FDI inflows go around the world and help different countries. Our chief economic advisor, Dr. Subramaniam, he had to leave early, but he answered some of the questions, and he shared his deep insights into the government thinking about revival and recovery of post-pandemic recovery of the Indian economy. And our two experts, Professor Manoj Pant and Deepak Bagla, and all of that, with all of you bringing, interventions in the discussion, became a very, very rich menu for today. And I hope we will continue this kind of a dialogue with ISID spearheading into industrial transformation of the country through this agenda and discussion, over time. And we look forward to many such occasions with all of you to participate and contribute and pull our heads together. So on that note, I want to really thank every one of you and also our partner for today, UNCTAD. And so, Richard, please convey my very heartfelt greetings and thanks to James. And of course, we will be in touch. I will be writing to him. But in the meanwhile, give him my very warm regards. So with that, thank you very much once again. And we are, just leaving each other. Goodbye. Bye-bye. Thank you.